Your vision of space is very firmly connected to Earth. As an MIT professor, you study space as a way to advance the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Is that vision of space in conflict with the vision of an Elon Musk or a Jeff Bezos, who look at space as a tourist destination? Jeff Bezos, as you know, is planning to blast off into space on an adventure ride next month. Is there a contradiction there, or in some way, are these two visions complementary?
Let's start by considering the history of human activity in space and celebrating that the early years of the space program, both in the United States but also the Soviet Union, countries like Germany and France, although there was competition, there was a lot of important diplomacy that happened. Countries came together and created a series of treaties, identified a few key values that actually have been playing out throughout human activity in space, including the idea that space is the heritage or the province of all humankind, and that all nations and all peoples really deserve to have the benefits of space. So I think of space as a public resource in a similar way to thinking about the oceans, our shared use of the atmosphere, and our use of Antarctica, for example, all places where countries have come together over history and found ways to cooperate together. Now, of course, if you think about the atmosphere and how we use the oceans, there's a mix of activities, some serving the public and some for private good. But you could ask, what's the fundamental reason that we think we have this resource? And I'd like to argue that space in particular is a platform for serving the broad public. We use satellites to observe the environment and the climate. We use satellites to connect people across different parts of the Earth and to give us information about our positions and our weather. All of these are broad public goods that really can serve people across the world all at once. And so for me, I think a lot about what it means for space to play a role, both to help us connect in kind of a symbolic way on Earth, but also in a very literal way. And so I think of space firstly as a place of public service rather than a place of commercial gain, although of course it enables economic activity all over the world, and that's something we can also celebrate.
But there's an important philosophical difference, is there not? I mean, Elon Musk talks about space as an escape from a dying planet. In this view, humans, I guess the wealthy ones, will set up colonies on Mars and look back at a distant Earth in flames. You, on the other hand, see space as a solution to Earth's problems.
And part of what I'd like to do today is just really highlight that people are listening closely to the voices of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos because they have money, not because they really represent the core dialogue or the core forces that are shaping our activities in space. So I'd like to broaden the dialogue. For example, when my research team considers who we want to listen to in space, one of the areas we go is to listen to indigenous communities and ask what's their generations-long view of space. We try to listen respectfully. Sometimes we have the chance to celebrate it by making art with them or videos or other ways of celebrating and archiving what they're sharing. But I'd just like to expand the voices that have a chance to shape. Also, speaking of science fiction writers, I have a great respect for Octavia Butler, and another author that people may be familiar with is Nnedi Okorafor, both Black women writing about space in a way that causes us to think differently about what it means to be human. So I'd love for these voices to be expanded and kind of balancing out some of the voices that are getting a lot of media attention right now. My goal is to ask, how do we achieve sustainability both on Earth and wherever humans choose to roam in space? And sustainability means we are treating in a fair and long-term viable way both our social system, meaning treating people as humans across different identities, our economic system, and our environmental system. We have not yet achieved this on Earth. I think we must continue to strive for it. And I hope that as humans get started with more and more activity in space, we seek to balance sustainability across these three areas.
Well, let me ask you that question then. In practical terms, how does space advance the UN Sustainable Development Goals? Can you give me a few examples?
I love giving examples of the ways that space technology supports sustainable development. And in particular, it's been convenient to use the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations as a nice checklist of which things we're trying to address. In my own work, for example, I'm often working on Sustainable Development Goal number 15. This focuses on life on land and asks, including other questions, it asks the question, can we ensure that our forests and our other biodiversity on land as well as on the coasts is healthy. I have projects right now, for example, with colleagues who are leading activities in coastal cities, especially in West Africa, including in the country of Benin and Ghana, as well as in South America, including in Rio de Janeiro and in Indonesia. In each of these areas, we're asking how can we support local governments and companies that are working toward sustainable environments in areas where the ocean and the land meet, especially addressing the management of important forests like mangroves. And we use satellite data along with data from measurements taken on the ground and in the water to understand what are the important trade-offs and making plans to help preserve important trees, other species, and to address invasive plants. All of this is important to coastal resilience in cities that are on the coast, especially those affected by climate change right now.
This year, even as COVID ripped through the developing world, including India, Brazil, the world was mesmerized by three separate Mars missions, one from the United States, one from China, one from the United Arab Emirates. What message do those missions send to an Earth in crisis?
So, in my doctoral studies, I studied the early space programs of several countries in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and Asia, including the United Arab Emirates. So, over the last 15 years, I've been observing that countries on every single continent around the world are dedicating themselves to being involved with space, and many have been developing programs to operate and build their own satellites and engage in other ways. So, I wasn't at all surprised to see the UAE arrive at Mars. 10 years ago, I was visiting their early space activities and seeing how they were quickly learning skills by collaborating with other more experienced space actors. And this is happening all over the world. So going forward, I hope people are celebrating each time a country reaches a new milestone. These are milestones not just for one country, but really for humanity, especially because space has always been collaborative. Any major space endeavor has always involved more than one country. And it's true of Mars missions as well. Anytime one country arrives at Mars, multiple countries are involved.
Is space the new industrial frontier? Is space where we're going to mine for metals, set up factories, power stations? And if so, is there a danger that humankind will simply export its pollution to outer space?
I am always driven by history when trying to understand what might come in the future. And I've been reflecting on the ways that over the last 500 years or so, we've invented technologies like the ocean going vessel that can carry a lot of cargo and also people, as well as technologies that came during the Industrial Revolution. And unfortunately, our pattern so far as humans has been to use these technologies to quickly try to expand economic activity, but not necessarily to consider the long term impacts on human laborers or on the environment. So I'm urging us to now think historically, and before we go forth and try similar methods of expansion of technology in space, I hope we ask, how can we do so with basically zero waste? If you think about a space station, we have the International Space Station in orbit now. It has a goal to aspire toward recycling air, so you breathe in oxygen, breathe out carbon dioxide, and there's systems that actually extract more oxygen so you can breathe it again. Recycling water, and then being able to eventually, it's not ready yet, but eventually be able to generate food right there on orbit. These are practices that will help us move toward using everything to generate what we need and thinking of really nothing as waste. We need to start inventing that in a radical way, both for our life on Earth and for the expanded human activities we probably will see in the next few years in space. Only when we think that way will we start to be moving towards sustainability. I think the default is actually that we just continue what we normally do on Earth, which is create a lot of uncontrolled waste streams. And this is already happening in orbit around the Earth. So my team works heavily on the topic of space debris. In fact, we just announced this past week a major milestone in a project called the Space Sustainability Rating. The Space Sustainability Rating is going to respond to the urgent crisis of a large amount of space debris of human objects already in orbit around the Earth. There are hundreds of thousands of objects, if not more, that some we can observe and some we can't. And these are left over from human missions where we have discarded waste already in orbit around the Earth. And right now, it looks like we're poised to have similar behavior when we start doing more activities on places like the moon and asteroids. Rather than that, what if we challenged ourselves to basically create processes where recycling, reuse, and the idea of thinking everything is actually valuable material, nothing's really trash. What if that was our driver as we move to places and work more on the moon? I also encourage us to consider the same way that we celebrate on Earth, places that are geologically and culturally valuable. We set aside areas as parks, like the Grand Canyon, for example, and we plan to not have pollution there or minimize pollution. And we plan to have it as a refuge and a place of enjoyment for generations to come. I think we need similar kinds of zoning, so to speak, on the moon. Something that's actually not really well defined in international space law, but it could be defined by consensus among spacefaring organizations that we want to keep some places, for example, on the moon, that we know are geologically really interesting or have sacred meaning for certain cultures and plan to not pollute them. This is quite doable if we move it forward.
In your writings and public speeches, you talk about space in the context of justice. Can you explain that connection? And how does this concept of justice relate to your own identity as an African American woman?
I am constantly redefining my definition of justice and refining it, drawing from authors who are queer Black feminists, because I think their definition of justice is good for everyone. If you look at some of the authors, especially I reference the Combahee River Collective, who was active just a few miles from where I am right now in Boston, and they wrote a manifesto highlighting the need for thinking about people as intersectional beings, meaning we are all individuals with identities, multiple ways of knowing ourselves. I'm a woman, I'm a professor, I'm a homeowner. I'm also somebody whose great grandfather was born enslaved in North Carolina. So I carry all these identities with me at all times. But of course, different forms of those affect my life in different ways, and that changes throughout my day. So I ask how to use this way of thinking, intersectional thinking, as we ask how are our technologies and our policies, our approaches to sustainability shaping justice? And this is a vital part of designing my research organization and designing how we pursue justice using space technology.
Two quick questions to close. I have to ask you this. Do you think that there's intelligent life on other planets?
Now, it's a great question in part because we are discovering so many other planets. Not myself personally, but of course, our space community over the last few decades has identified so many planets, that some of which appear to have a lot in common with Earth in terms of how far they are from the sun they're orbiting and the potential shape and maybe the atmosphere. I think we really know very little about what's happening and who might be doing activities around the galaxies. But what's interesting next will be for us to ask the question, has there ever been life that we can recognize with our limited definition of life on Mars? There's flowing water on Mars, seasonally flowing, and there's strong evidence of past lakes and areas that water could have been in great concentrations. So our very next question that we can understand is, could we recognize life in the form that we know, or at least the fossils of it on Mars? That would already be revolutionary to our understanding.
Dr. Danielle Wood, it's been a real privilege talking with you. Thank you so much for your time and for your insights.
Thank you.